Welcome back. You have finished reading Act 3, and so now we're going to talk about that on the plot diagram. Um, Act 1, of course, was the exposition. Act 2 was the rising action. So now Act 3 is going to be the climax of the story. We know the climax is the turning point, which means this is the part in the play where it goes from being just a regular love story to something else. And everything that happens here affects the rest of the storyline. The first thing in the turning point is after the wedding, Romeo and Juliet have a plan that they're each going to go home, and then he will sneak into her room later that night after everybody's gone to bed, and then they will run away together and live happily ever after. Or they'll just keep their marriage a secret for a while and then eventually tell their parents. Unfortunately, on the way home, Romeo runs into everybody in the town square. It's Mercutio, Tybalt, Benvolio, all those people. As we remember from the party, Tybalt was forced to back away from the fight with Romeo, but he vows a fight later on. And so what he did was he sent a letter to Romeo's house challenging him to a duel. Romeo wasn't home because he was with Juliet and doesn't know anything about it, but Benvolio and Mercutio do. And so Tybalt is there to have the duel, and Romeo doesn't know what he's talking about, and Tybalt keeps trying to fight with him, and Romeo keeps just walking away, and he says he doesn't want to fight him because he doesn't hate him anymore. He loves him. We know that he's talking about the fact that he's just married Tybalt's cousin, Juliet, and so now they're technically family, and Romeo doesn't want to fight Tybalt. Everybody else thinks that he's just lost his mind and doesn't know what's going on, and so Mercutio tries to help Romeo save face and not look like a coward by jumping in and aggravating Tybalt. And so they're kind of play fighting a little bit and just kind of goofing off, but then the crowd starts laughing and they start getting embarrassed and they start getting mad. And the next thing you know, Tybalt accidentally kills Mercutio. He just kind of falls on his sword, and he didn't mean to do it, but anytime you're playing with long, pointed, sharp objects, somebody's going to get hurt. So Tybalt ends up getting stabbed. Tybalt ends up stabbing Mercutio. Once he realizes what he's done, he and his friends run away. Romeo and his friends don't realize that Mercutio has been hurt because he's kind of a goofball and has been, saying silly things all along, and so they think he's just acting. And so they're like, "Are you hurt?" And he says, "Oh, no, it's not too bad, but it's enough." And then he says all these riddles, kind of trying to say that he's been hurt, but he never really comes out and says it. And so finally he says, "If you look for me tomorrow, you shall find me a grave man." And grave has two meanings, one meaning serious and one meaning dead. And so they, of course, think he means serious, and just mistakenly don't understand what he's trying to tell them. Finally, he says, "A plague on both your houses. You've made worms meat of me." And so what he's saying is it's because of the feud between the two families that he's been killed. And then he falls down dead. And then that's when Romeo realizes that Tybalt has killed Mercutio. Now, unfortunately, Romeo, as we have come to know, does not always think things through. What he should have done here was to go tell the prince what had happened and let the prince handle it. But instead, Romeo goes off on, crazed vengeance and chases after Tybalt. They end up fighting, and Romeo ends up killing Tybalt. Now this is bad for a number of reasons, because the prince has already said whoever starts the next fight is going to be sentenced to death. So instead of Tybalt being punished, Romeo's the one that's going to be punished. Secondly, he has just killed his wife's cousin, and now he's worried that she's going to hate him because of what has happened. The next piece of the turning point is that Romeo is exiled by the prince for killing Tybalt. In a way, that's a good thing because he's not being sentenced to death, and the prince realizes that Romeo was just doing what the law would have done, punishing Tybalt. But he was not supposed to take the law into his own hands, and he still needs to be punished. And so he ends up telling Romeo that he has to leave town and to never come back. This puts a giant crimp in Romeo and Juliet's plan to live secretly married, because now they will never be able to see each other. Now, I know the modern you is thinking, well, why doesn't she just run away with him, or leave town with him, and live their lives together? Well, keep in mind that during this period, as I told you before, that girls really had no rights and were not able to go anywhere on their own. So it would have been bad enough for her to run away with him to begin with, but now to run away with her cousin's killer would really be bad. And her father would chase them down and kill Romeo. So that is really not an option. Lord Capulet and his wife, think that Juliet is in her room crying and crying over her cousin's death, but really we know that she's crying because Romeo has to leave town. And they say their goodbyes. He leaves, and Lord Capulet decides this might be a good time for Juliet to maybe marry Paris. We know that Paris was interested in marrying her, and Paris is related to the prince. The prince is mad at the Capulets, so this might be a good time to arrange that marriage and maybe even things back out again and get the prince back on their side. So he arranges for that, and Juliet up to this point has always been a very obedient daughter and always does what her parents ask. And so they expect her to, just say, okay, that's fine. And when they go to tell her that they've arranged for her to marry Paris in 2 days, instead of saying, okay, she has a meltdown and screams and hollers that she will not go to the church and marry Paris. She even says, this is verbal irony, because she says, I would rather marry Romeo than marry Paris. We all know that's what she really means. The rest of the cast think that she's just lost her mind, because Romeo would be the worst person in the world to ever marry, because he's a Montague and he just killed Tybalt. The last part of this is once her parents, tell her if she doesn't show up at the church, they're going to disown her and kick her out on the street. She won't have anywhere to go. And so they leave. The nurse comes in, and Juliet runs to the nurse, who, has always been on her side, always helped her, always given her advice, and says, "Nurse, what can I do? Please tell me." And the nurse tells her, Romeo's gone and he can't come back, so the best thing to do is to forget about that marriage and just go ahead and marry Paris. Well, this is a huge letdown for Juliet. She can't believe the nurse has said this, and she now knows that she's totally alone. She has no one to turn to. Romeo's gone, her parents are mad at her, the nurse has let her down, so the only person left is herself to depend on. So that's where we end Act 3. You can see there's lots of things going on here. Relationships are shattered. Romeo and Juliet are separated. It's just a big mess. So Act 4 is going to be the falling action, where things start winding down now that all these things have happened. All right, so I'll see you back at the end of Act 4.